For those of you who are not familiar with Gigi's, we're a startup nonprofit shelter and organization, opened our doors in late 2018. Since then, we've grown to over a 6,000 acre campus with 26,000 square feet of building space, including housing for dogs within our shelter, indoor and outdoor exercise and training space, a state-of-the-art veterinary hospital, including an isolated, really one of its kind canine parvovirus treatment center, as well as office space for experts across behavior, veterinary medicine, and population management. We have an in-house behavior team that works to improve behavior and prevent psychological decline, really for all of the dogs in our shelter, but also to provide individualized behavior modification and training for dogs who do have identified mild to moderate behavioral challenges. We also have a separate public-facing behavior team that works to help keep dogs with those behavioral challenges in their homes, keep them out of the shelter, and do what we can to try to maintain that bond and keep them there. And then we also have a newly launched rescue services program that offers access to low-cost veterinary and behavior care to regional nonprofit shelter and rescues. Our intake, so where we get our dogs, it is dogs only. It is managed and limited to just 6 rural partner shelters. These are all in impoverished areas of southern Ohio. And really, myself, I have the privilege of overseeing all behavior programming, as well as the integration of behavior into all animal care, handling, including medical and euthanasia protocols and procedures. So I'm truly honored to be able to share my experiences and the insight this job. I don't even call it a job. It's really it's it's a career, it's a dream. I'm very fortunate for that, and I'm happy to share it in this two-part presentation where we'll focus on how we balance and navigate adoption placement and humane euthanasia decisions for dogs with behavior challenges. So when we talk about behavior challenges in shelter dogs, most are going to fall into one of 3 broad categories. The first is going to be our stress-related behaviors. These are basically coping responses to the acute stress of the shelter environment as these dogs attempt to regain what we call psychological homeostasis. So this might look like social withdrawal, mild forms of aggression such as growling when cornered or trapped, maybe some stress vocalization and kennel, maybe some various more frenetic displacement behaviors as they try to really deal with the conflict, angst, anxiety, frustration, and fear that they're experiencing in that shelter. The second category is going to include behaviors that are normal, but really considered unruly or unwanted by humans. So think of jumping up, pulling on leash, mouthy play, nuisance barking, chewing, etc., etc. And these are behaviors that they're developmentally normal, particularly in young dogs, so our juveniles, our adolescents, and these behaviors are often inadvertently reinforced by our caretakers. Yet they're highly undesirable from the human perspective, and really from the adopter perspective, which is what matters in the shelter most. And then our third category is what we call pathologic behaviors or pathology. And this is where things get more serious. So we may see uninhibited or persistent aggression, really beyond what could be attributed to that acute stress phase. Our phobias, panic disorders, including those that we might see as a result of either isolation distress or separation anxiety. We can see dogs with crippling global fear, hyperarousal or overarousal, and even persistent, what we call generalized anxiety. Now, we can't also forget that there may be underlying medical issues or pain that can drive or worsen any of these behaviors, though today my focus is going to be on primary behavioral causes. And without intervention, the likelihood of these behaviors persisting in an adoptive home are going to vary based on the category and severity. I mean, those of you who've read No Better Than Flipping a Coin, the meta-analysis of behavior assessments, shows us that it's really can be difficult to predict the behavior of a dog in a shelter and how it's going to be in a home. That said, I think if we're looking at these categories, some may be more telling than others. So for, let's say, stress-related behaviors, if we can get the dog with just purely stress-related behavior challenges placed quickly into a home, I'd say there's probably a high likelihood those behaviors will improve and in many cases resolve once the environmentally induced stress, if that's indeed what it is eliminated. So out of the shelter into a home quickly, these dogs are probably going to be just fine and do well, and we won't necessarily see those behaviors in the home. For our unruly behaviors, though, It's not like, I mean, these are normal, probably well-rehearsed behaviors, so it is likely that these challenges will persist in that adoptive home because we really have to work to teach dogs alternate behaviors. And if there hasn't been any intervention, we haven't reduced that, then we're probably still going to see those in the home. Now, that doesn't mean they can't go to training and work on them, but we need to kind of set those expectations that these dogs may need a little fine-tuning. And similarly with pathologic behaviors, these are also not likely to spontaneously resolve. These especially are going to carry a high likelihood of persistence, even progression, if placed in an adoptive home. And it's important to recognize there's considerable overlap between categories of shelter behavior challenges. Many dogs present with both stress-related and unruly behaviors, and stress itself often amplifies unruly behaviors dramatically. And so it does kind of muddy the waters a bit and can be a little more difficult to tell what is the biggest influencing factor here. Most critically, if dogs with any of these challenges are subject to chronic stress and given repeated opportunities to rehearse these maladaptive behavioral patterns, as often occurs with a prolonged length of shelter stay, both your stress-related and unruly behaviors can shift towards pathology. In essence, length of stay poses a serious threat to behavioral health in shelter dogs, and I cannot emphasize that more. The longer they are there, despite your best efforts, things are going to shift in that pathology direction. All right, now let's consider a scenario of a shelter that does have means and resources to intervene and support these dogs with behavioral challenges. So, with appropriate use of psychopharmacology and targeted enrichment, our stress-related behaviors often have a pretty high likelihood of improvement within the shelter environment, at least for a period of time. For unruly behaviors, again, given a shelter that has the resources and ability to provide these outlets for them, a combination of psychopharmacology to help buffer the inevitable worsening of behavior that's going to be caused by stress should they remain in the shelter longer term, adding targeted enrichment and frequent enrichment. So these dogs have other things to do better than spinning, jumping, mouthing, and losing their minds. And then we add behavior modification or training aimed to address specific unwanted behaviors. So if they are jumping up constantly, we're working on teaching them to keep four on the floor or put their butt on the ground when they're approaching people. So actually doing behavior mod and training to train them to alternate behaviors. But really, these need to be kept up with on a daily basis because you're also fighting the rehearsal of the unwanted behaviors that may be happening with certain volunteers, staff, or the general public if they are allowed to interact with these dogs on their own. But that said, if we can provide these three modalities in the shelter regularly and pretty strictly, we have a decent chance of improving these behaviors in the shelter environment. Now we get to the pathology. This is a different story. So when we talk about pathology behaviors, it helps to take a step back and really look where they come from. So what are the influences? How does a dog end up with behavior pathology? Well, one of our strongest influences is going to be genetics. So many pathologic behaviors are heritable, meaning the tendency or the actual trait is going to get passed from the parents to their offspring. That's why we sometimes see dogs raised in a wonderful, nurturing environment who still go on to develop serious behavioral issues once they reach social maturity. I saw this quite a bit when I was in clinical practice, and client after client just devastated that this is the 10th, 11th, 12th dog they've raised since a puppy, and they'd never experienced a dog with this type of behaviors because genetics are playing a huge role, and they were dealt a different hand with this particular dog. But not all pathology is going to come from genetics. Some dogs without that predisposition develop issues because of their environment. And one aspect of that environment may be something we call epigenetics. So that's where early environmental influences actually change how the genes are expressed in that animal without actually altering the DNA itself. A classic case is, say, a dam that's chronically stressed during pregnancy. So the developing puppies in utero are going to be exposed to high cortisol levels, so the stress hormone. And that excess stress hormone during brain development can alter the hypothalamo pituitary adrenal, also known as that HPA axis, the stress axis. So then these puppies may go on to become adults who are overly sensitive to threats, like they are paranoid, they're worried, they're suspicious. They then have an exaggerated stress response if something does frighten them, and then they struggle to recover once they've been triggered. It's almost like that that HPA access does not have a shut-off switch. And once it's triggered, it really takes them a long time to calm down. And that's just a change in brain chemistry based on those early hormonal influences in utero. Another major influence is inadequate socialization, and this is so underappreciated by so many veterinarians and medical staff that I talk to who are so very mainly focused on preventing infectious disease. But inadequate socialization during that sensitive period, which is between 3 and 12 weeks of age, we have a ton of evidence by Scott and Fuller, researchers from the 1960s, who really honed in on this period. It's essential that if they don't get positive or even neutral exposure to different people, animals, and environments during this window, we're often going to see, they're going to see those same things as novel and potentially dangerous when they encounter them as adults. And for many dogs, if it's dangerous, they're afraid, and that fear translates to fear-based aggression. And so inadequate socialization is a huge influencer on the development of pathology behaviors. And finally, trauma during a fear period can have lifelong consequences. There are two of these fear period windows, one around 8 to 10 weeks of age and a second one during adolescence that lasts a few weeks but varies across individuals in its timing. A traumatic experience during these times, whether it's a physical experience like pain or psychological like fear, can create a permanent fear response, similar to what we might see in PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. An example might be a puppy that's attacked by another dog during a fear period. That can carry lifelong fear and even aggression towards other dogs forever. And I mean, we can do a great deal of work to try to counteract it, but if it happens in this period, it can be very, very difficult. So in short, pathology develops as a result of multiple potential factors and various combinations thereof, right? You may have some mild genetic predisposition, but, huge detriments in inadequate socialization and trauma, all of those come together. And while you may only have small influences each of them, the effect together is cumulative. And then on top of this, the stress of shelter life on an already established or maybe a freshly developing pathology, you really have a recipe for major exacerbation of issues, as well as an animal that's likely to be refractory to a lot of your intervention attempts. So just things to keep in mind. All right, so remember from our initial slide, we talked about how pathology behaviors seen in shelter dogs will most often persist even in a stable home environment. So there are some shelters, though, that will attempt to modify pathology behaviors in their shelters. They have the means to put tremendous effort, first of all, into a psychopharmacological plan. Secondly, a behavioral and environmental enrichment catered to that individual dog. Substantial behavior modification and training to try to change the underlying emotional disorder that is causing the problem, as well as very strict avoidance of any triggering events or stimuli that might cause that behavior to surface so that we don't get any rehearsal. So they may be able to manage this behavior in the shelter, at least for some period of time, right? If they're doing all four of these things, again, pretty intense, very resource draining to accomplish this for one dog. But for more moderate pathologies, that's really what it takes every day to that extent. I mean, really based on what that individual dog's specific pathology is. The problem is here that despite this blood, sweat, tears of your behavior team and your veterinary team for psychopharm, our pathologic behaviors do not typically go away. And they're still highly likely to persist once in that home. Trying to look at shelters as a board and train to fix pathologies is really probably inaccurate. I understand the intention and the drive and the desire, but the reality is it's still likely to persist in a home if it's a true pathology. So then we walk through some other individual behaviors. So aggression that we see in a shelter. Is that always a pathology? Do we say, and a dog is showing aggression in the shelter, immediately this goes into the pathology category? I mean, not necessarily. Inhibited aggression on the day of arrival or the day after may just be a normal stress or pain-related behavior, depending what's going on with them medically. So dogs that might growl, lip curl, or even air snap, and while retreating, like they're trying to back away, they're really wanting to avoid the situation or the interaction, but they're stuck. All depends on that context and the stress levels. But that acute stress phase is hard for a lot of dogs. And so if they're really trying to avoid and the aggression you see is very inhibited, they're not actually biting, they're not causing injury, then this may not be a pathology. This may actually be a stress-related behavior. When we get into persistent, delayed, or what we call uninhibited aggression, that's a little more worrisome. So that may and likely indicates that there's a pathology going on here. And you have to consider your staff's safety, the people handling these animals daily. Are they going to be safe from a dog who potentially could bite them severely? And it's also good to know that just because a dog doesn't show any aggression those first few days or first week, 10 days, does not mean it doesn't exist. So stress can very well inhibit a dog from showing aggression initially. So while they may have had an existing pathology in a previous home, they're, surrendered to a shelter, and everyone at the shelter says, this dog's not aggressive, I don't see it. Well, often that acute stress phase just shuts them down. They are not willing to use aggression. They're not brave enough. They're not comfortable enough. And so the ones where they start showing aggression later in their length of stay. So 10 days, 14 days, now we start to see a dog lunging, trying to bite people. He didn't do that in the beginning. That really worries me that this may be the dog's true behavior because initially they were too stressed, too inhibited, and now that they're feeling more comfortable, they're willing to express themselves when they're feeling threatened and afraid with aggression. So, again, that early initial, I'm trapped, I need to protect myself, aggression, day 0 to 1, potentially normal, potentially stress related, but what develops later is probably real and more likely on the pathology side. What about extreme fear? Those are completely shut down, crippled with fear. They're in this profoundly negative welfare state. I mean, these are heartbreaking dogs, right? It can really sometimes be difficult to distinguish between these shell-shocked pets. They've just come from a loving home and now they're in this scary, stressful shelter environment. I think a lot of our pets would shut down and really look a lot like a dog that maybe was never socialized to people and are essentially feral. So it can sometimes we have this question: are we fearful or are we feral? Right? Like they're dogs that were maybe they were raised outdoors, never around people, or in someone's basement and did not get socialized to people. They are essentially feral because they do not have a connection with humans at all, and that does not make for a very good pet, not for their welfare or for the safety or enjoyment of an adoptive home. So in that acute stress phase, sometimes they can be indistinguishable. So Hennessy and colleagues studied acute stress in dogs in a U.S. county shelter. Actually, this shelter was in Ohio, in fact, just over an hour away from Gigi's. And this group, this was done several decades ago, but they found that plasma cortisol levels, when they test that stress hormone cortisol in the blood of shelter dogs, that this is going to remain elevated for about the first 3 days. So significantly higher day 0, 1, 2, and 3. And even more so, you're going to see another drop after about 10 days. So while there's individual variation in cortisol, and it's not a complete nor a perfect measure of stress in dogs, these findings speak to an initial acute stress phase, and that on average, dogs experience higher stress during the first few days after their shelter intake. And in my experience, and we are currently collecting data on this at Gigi's with every dog that comes in with this type of behavior, we find that dogs who do have a social connection, so in their brain, there is memories of socialization. There is a connection there. They're just shut down and terrified because of the acute stress of being in the shelter. Most of those dogs are going to start to show at least some improvement around day 3 to 4. You start to see some wiggle. You start to see some tail wag. You start to see some willingness to come forward and to take treats. And then that progresses with even greater, more substantial improvement by day 7. Again, we are recording all of this for these dogs so that I can better speak to this data. I'm just sharing my impression at the moment. And so maybe immediate placement into foster care could abbreviate this recovery, right? If they are truly more comfortable in a home. But an unsocialized dog, so a dog that has never been socialized to people and is older than 12 weeks of age, because when that window closes, you don't get that time back, right? So if you have a 14, 15-week-old puppy that has never been around humans, that dog is essentially feral, and it's going to take, I mean, for them to be a normal pet is next to impossible. It's very, very difficult. You're asking someone to take on something pretty traumatic, both for that home and for that dog. but because they're really unlikely to show substantial improvement in the first several days. So if it's truly a dog that has not been socialized, you're probably not going to see improvement even in that first week. And so we kind of look at day 3 for at least some inkling of human connection. And then really day 7, if we're not seeing any connection, we're strongly suspicious that they are not really comfortable being in the presence of humans and may not be comfortable being in a home as a pet. While psychopharmacological intervention and counter conditioning, some comfort with the foster may develop. Um, so if you put these very, very under-socialized puppies or dogs into foster, if they're over 12 weeks of age, it's going to be such slow, minute progress. And whatever connection they establish with that foster, then trying to transfer that to a new adopter, it's like you're starting all over again. And because of that hardship, this is really hard for fosters to see these dogs just remain in this utter state of fear. It may be best to reserve foster homes for dogs who at least show some level of improvement after those first 3 days. And so maybe holding on to them for 3 days just to see if we can get an inkling of hope that there's a connection. Um, Unless you have designated what we call special fosters, and those are amazing fosters, hold on to them forever, where they know how to interact or not interact with these special dogs. And they really kind of recognize that this dog may not end up meeting adoption criteria. And they're going to be able to give honest and realistic feedback on how that dog does in a home. By all means, if you have that option, get the dog into that foster home right away. But for our average foster, there may be some heartbreak involved if we're giving them high risk dogs that may not be socialized at all. So it's just something to consider for our extreme fear. All right, so back to our dogs we suspect have pathology behaviors. We're going to talk later about severity, safety, and the ability to safely manage dogs with behavioral challenges. But for now, I want to talk about the investment required in trying to place these dogs through a shelter. So successful long-term adoption may be possible, but only when the shelter invests significant time, expertise, and follow-up. So this is going to start with marketing. So marketing can help bring attention to these harder to place dogs, but it has to be transparent. Potential adopters deserve to know exactly what they're signing up for, and that disclosure is what allows them to make an informed decision. Of course, that kind of honesty, we get it, can create hesitancy. If you're really blatantly honest, particularly in an online description, it can be difficult to find adopters who are actually willing and interested in meeting that dog, let alone investing in the necessary ongoing management that's going to be required for that. On the other hand, we sometimes see adopters, and this is particularly for our purebred dogs, or people, or dogs that are visually appealing. So an adopter may be interested in a certain dog because of their breed, their size, or some other physical trait. Um, and then when they come in, they see a dog is being very carefully managed in the shelter. They don't necessarily understand the level of care and management that's going to be needed for safety and success of that dog in a home. So they kind of don't understand the reality, and they're kind of stuck in this fantasy of the looks of this dog. And in those cases, the placement team needs to help guide the decision to make sure that match is truly an appropriate one. And then even once the dog is adopted, the resources don't stop there. These dogs need ongoing support. We got to help set up a smooth transition into the home and help troubleshoot issues as that dog settles in. Otherwise, they're going to face a very hasty return to that shelter. They need help. These adopters need support. Because even though the change is a good change, they're going from a shelter to a home, it's still a change, and change can be hard for a lot of these dogs with pathologies. For dogs with a history of aggression, the stakes are especially high. Shelters can face legal liability if an injury occurs after adoption, particularly when behavior issues were known but not disclosed. I've reviewed multiple lawsuits in this area and as an expert witness, and in each case, the deciding factor was evidence that the shelter knew about aggression but withheld it or downplayed that information to the adopter, and the results were devastating, both financially and emotionally for everyone involved. So just keep this in mind if you're considering moving forward with housing and trying to place these dogs with major pathologies. And so we're seeing more pressure, even legal mandates for live release outcomes above 90%, as well as a growing number of dogs with behavior challenges in need of adoptive homes. And we're unfortunately seeing more of these dogs fill our shelters. It's true for us at Gigi's as well as our partners. And these dogs are facing prolonged lengths of stay without the support needed to maintain behavioral health and wellness, which is substantial, as I've just mentioned. So as I get into part two later for this presentation, we're going to focus on what it takes to support these dogs. But let's move on to now how we can support them. And then part two, we will get into the full decision-making process. So let's start with housing. Above all, the safety of people caring for these dogs and the overall welfare of the dogs themselves are the top priorities. One of the best setups is that if it's possible, is that guillotine style double kennel, where a single dog, so one dog for a double-sided kennel, we're not putting one dog on each side. So they have access to both sides. So from a safety standpoint, this design allows caretakers to safely secure the dog on one side while they clean, refresh food and water on the other. All without close contact if we're talking about a dog with potential aggression. Full physical and visual barriers between kennels are essential, not only to prevent inter-dog aggression through the kennel. Trust me, I have seen some pretty horrific injuries from inter-kennel fighting of dogs pulling faces and tongues through bars or chain link fencing that separated dogs. But we also want to provide dogs with a sense of security in their own space. Having to be stared at or stare at other dogs can be very stressful if it's done 24/7. Full or partial barriers between the kennel front and high traffic areas, so areas where people and dogs are constantly walking by, at least some sort of partial barrier, and if needed, we can add a full barrier to reduce the stress of that, reduce the reactivity that may develop as they repeatedly are exposed to things walking by and then maybe start to bark and react towards them. And then finally, thinking about having fewer dogs housed in each housing suite is going to be better. Ideally, we're talking about 5 dogs or fewer per area if we're housing behaviorally challenged dogs together. Because when you have too many vocal or reactive dogs together, they're going to feed off one another, and that's going to escalate distress all around. For shy and fearful dogs, they're going to benefit greatly from visual and auditory buffers. At Gigi's, we had the fortune of designing from scratch, as we were building, several kennels as individual rooms. So they have full doors, they create a sensory deprivation chamber, so to speak. We have the option to hang a shower curtain over the door for full visual blocking for dogs who are not ready to see people. Let's say they're in their initial 3-day period for our really shy, fearful shutdown dogs. Each room has a sound system to play classical music or reggae during the daytime hours, with the window set high in the kennel to allow natural sunlight without visual exposure to outdoor stimuli. We installed epoxy-coated treat holes that you can see there in the doors so that palatable food can be dropped into the kennel for counter conditioning without having to open the door and stress the dog out. This allows the dogs to gain a positive association just with the sight of people on the other side of that door without having their full physical presence when they're not ready for it. And if they're not ready to walk outside, we have an atrium in the suite and can use X-pens with visual barriers for them to retreat during kennel cleaning. This girl here you see in the photo came to us with newborn puppies and was completely shut down. I mean, just completely shell-shocked when she arrived. But after a few days of decompression, this is day 3 for her. So by being able to be housed in an area that was quiet, more secure, secluded, she could adjust. And we were able to see that social dog come out. It was wonderful. All right, so meeting dogs' daily needs. I have what I call the inverted triangle of activity because I can't think of a better word for it. And it starts with the big part of the triangle, which is our physical exercise. So moving your muscles. In an ideal world, that's for 20 minutes, whether it's romping in an off-leash fenced area or going for a brisk walk or just throwing a ball or a treat from one side of the kennel to another. You're moving your muscles for 20 minutes. The next step is mental stimulation. So having them use their brain for 3 to 5 minutes, teaching a new trick or rehearsing ones they already know. Getting further into the kind of a state of calm, as you can see where we're going. We're starting from big activities to calm activities, is social stimulation. So whether that's hanging out with them in kennel, giving them pets and snuggles if that's something they truly enjoy, or maybe just sitting next to them, reading a book, working on your phone or computer so they have that social one-on-one contact they're so desperate for. And then we point the end of the triangle, we conclude this with some sort of self-soothing enrichment, whether that's just scattering treats all over the kennel, so we call a treat bomb, or some sort of frozen puzzle toy when we return to kennel. The idea is that we get the needs met in a particular order, and it's always in this order every day so that it's predictable. And all of these things predict some sort of self-soothing enjoyable activity within the kennel so that you can walk away and we don't then leave dogs in desperation and vocalizing waiting for us to come back and showing quite a bit of kennel distress. Now this doesn't always prevent that, but it can be very helpful. Personnel are very important. Dogs with behavior challenges need skilled, knowledgeable handlers. They need to be fluent in reading body language, being able to handle them should an aggressive event occur. Fear-free shelter certification can be very helpful, but it isn't the whole story. Want to make sure you have a team to provide for their extra needs and provide that post-op follow-up. And as I mentioned previously, length of stay is one of your worst enemies when it comes to managing dogs with behavioral challenges. Much of this has to do with the emotional imprint chronic stress can have on the anatomy and physiology of the brain. To illustrate this, let's look at the limbic system here and its role in stress. So the amygdala is the first alert system, which is going to send signals to the hypothalamus, which is then going to trigger your HP axis that we talked about earlier, as well as the sympathetic nervous system for cortisol and adrenaline release. Simultaneously, that amygdala is going to send a message to the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex via the thalamus. And so you're going to have memory storage there. This is an immediate and highly effective process to help animals remember danger in the future. Now, in a behaviorally healthy dog, the hippocampus, hypothalamus, and prefrontal cortex will help regulate or dampen this fear response and memory consolidation if there really isn't a threat or it's very short-lived. The problem is, studies have shown us that with chronic stress, in various mammals, including primates and rodents, those who are subject to chronic, recurrent, inescapable stress have shown evidence of cellular atrophy, or what we call cell death, in these regulatory areas. And so essentially, these dogs have what we might call an emotional brain damage from chronic stress. And there are just very few dogs resilient enough to withstand weeks to months inside the shelter. That even our shelter, which is a palace of a shelter, it's difficult. It's really hard for them to maintain normal brain chemistry and quality of life with a long-term stay. We're going to see signs of where some can adapt very well. They develop coping strategies and they can handle that prolonged stress. But at some point, most of these dogs' adaptive responses are going to decline within a few weeks. And the signs of where are going to be different. It might look like kind of grouchy, nippy behavior with other dogs. It can be other, stereotypical behaviors like spinning that this dog is showing here. We can see recurrent gastrointestinal bugs, Campylobacter, sporulating Clostridium. Sorry, let me stop. As well as other physical things like hair loss. So this guy here, fortunately, that's him before. You see all those patchy signs of thinning hair. We did every skin test in the world and could not find anything wrong with him. And then he finally got into a foster home and it all grew back. And then he was adopted, thank goodness. But there are physical problems that we can see from stress as well. You want to be mindful of choosing your fosters for behavior dogs because if they're a first-time foster, throwing them a behavior challenge could be very devastating and difficult for them and turn them away from foster indefinitely. So they're not for our first-time foster families. You want to make sure they're experienced and are prepared for a longer-term fostering. And we can set them up for success by making sure they have training on body language, aggression management, breaking up dog fights if they have their own dogs, and knowing how and when they should meet adopters. Maddie's University has great resources. If you have not utilized them, I encourage you to do so. And consider in-home behavior professionals so that they can work with those behaviors in the home where they're actually going to have an impact. And then partner with the veterinarian for your psychopharmacology. All right, so my last slide, I'm just briefly touch on making difficult choices, the reason you're here today. So I wish I had a simple one-size-fits-all algorithm, but unfortunately, these decisions are seldom black and white. In some cases, the choice is obvious, right? You have dogs that have wonderful welfare. It's clear they're adoptable. Get them out of the shelter. And then there's others where it's obvious, like this dog has very poor welfare. They're very aggressive and dangerous. This is a clear humane euthanasia decision. Just about everything else, though, falls in what we call the gray zone. What's also important to consider is that the resources of an individual organization will and should change the threshold for what might warrant a euthanasia call. For example, a dog with a history of mild aggression or an overactive adolescent who's showing unruly and painful mouthing, for example, in a shelter that doesn't really have resources to help them, that they're gray, they're going to have a darker shade of gray in their spectrum. Compared to that same dog in a shelter that has fully developed behavior teams, veterinarians to prescribe psychopharm, and space to make sure their needs are met, right? The threshold for behavior euthanasia is going to be much different for that dog, right? At least initially. All right, thank you for your attention. I will see you for part 2, humane euthanasia in the context of behavior and welfare.